In today's World Insight, South Korea's president on a state visit to Washington on the heels of an unflattering U.S. intelligence leak. What's the likely outcome of the visit? What does the visit mean for security in East Asia and the world? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Live from Beijing, I'm Tian Wei, and this is World Insight. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol is paying a state visit to the U.S. this week, the first visit to Washington by a South Korean leader since 2011 to mark the 70th anniversary of their alliance. Mr. Yoon is accompanied by a 122-person business delegation to bolster trade ties from advanced technologies to cultural content. The visit also comes at a time when Seoul faces Pyongyang's renewed nuclear tests and heavy pressure from Washington to supply arms to Ukraine, as shown in a U.S. intelligence leak earlier this month. So what's likely to be the outcome of the visit? What does the visit mean for the U.S., for South Korea, and for the security situation in Northeast Asia? Let's ask our panelists. For more, joining us in Seoul, Yeonjung Lim, Associate Professor of Division of International Studies at Koongju National University. Ms. Lim, what a pleasure to see you. Long time no see. Hope everything is doing well. In Washington, D.C., Surabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist from the Institute for China-American Studies. And we hope we are going to have very soon a Chinese guest joining us later in the program. Let me start by asking Ms. Lim about South Korea President's visit. A lot of expectations, I guess, in South Korea at a very critical time, but the critical balance President Yoon need to keep during his visit in order to make sure when he comes back to the Northeast Asia neighborhood, it will be ultimately the interest of South Korea that's being taken care of. That is a very interesting question, isn't it?
Well, sure. You're very right. As you just mentioned, this is a very critical timing. Everything is pretty on tension, economically, politically, militarily. Of course, this is not we South Korea wanted to see, but time has changed, and now we see many those types of different tensions. And especially having had the North Korea's nuclear threat just, rising continuously, increasingly, many of us, majority of South Korean people, we're really concerned about the deterrence, how effective our deterrence capability can work to really avoid any serious violence in this region. So definitely we all looking forward to the further discussion on the security cooperation with the United States.
Right. Does anything like six-party talks, a phrase still familiar to the ears of many of our viewers who certainly have been going through the ups and downs of the region for the past decades? The reason why there were a six-party talks is because no party, one party or two or three, will be able to resolve, the very in-depth differences and complicated issues like the DPRK nuclear issue, Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. So will South Korea, U.S., even with Japan's role, things can be handled? Ms. Lim?
Well, you really highlighted an important point. I truly miss the time, again, when the U.S., China can talk together, cooperate together to solve this specific issue. And at that time, again, the China's leadership was really big, again, in moderating, facilitating the conversation, dialogues to solve this issue. The thing is, structurally, many things changed, especially Russia. Ever since the Russia's invasion to Ukraine, again, all these tensions are very much high. I don't want to give up my own hopes to back again the China's leadership or the U.S.-China cooperation in again to deal with this specific issue. But again, I truly want to see that. But again, at the same time, I do see the very much serious structural challenges these days.
Right. Certainly, things have changed a lot. Mr. Gupta, go to you. Yeah, Washington has been talking big words, especially. Well, I'm told by my producer right now we are having Mr. Gupta off the line for the moment. I'm going to come back to him a bit later. Professor Shen, you're joining us through also virtual possibility. So let's see how it works. Professor Shen, how do you see the delicate balance Seoul needs to keep during his visit, President Yoon's visit to Washington, that ultimately it is Seoul's interest, South Korea's interest, and the neighborhood's interest that's going to be taken care of and not be overwhelmed by the U.S. agenda?
Well, that's a very delicate business. In the security area, Seoul heavily depends upon the U.S. extended deterrence, including the nuclear umbrella. But that obviously would offend North Korea because North Korea considers that such a strengthening of Seoul-Washington military tie undercuts North Korea's interest. So how to secure more U.S. security commitment to South Korea without offending North Korea is very delicate. In the meantime, how to meet Americans, to secure America's market without losing Chinese market, that's also a mission impossible. Washington wants to have the chip airlines to undercut China, but that would undercut South Korea's interest as well. Extremely difficult.
Now, I'm told Mr. Gupta is once again back into the conversation. Mr. Gupta, your thoughts on the delicate balance for South Korea. Meanwhile, will U.S. agenda overwhelm the conversation?
Yes, it is a very delicate balance for South Korea, but as we've seen with this South Korean president, he's not looking necessarily for balance. He talks the language of universal values. He wants a tight trilateral relationship with the United States and Japan. So South Korea must seek balance itself in the first place if it wants to have a balanced relationship. And I'm not sure if this South Korean president prioritizes that, and that he hopes that through this universal values rhetoric and with the Americans leading, that he will be able to deter the North Koreans. But I don't see how he can actually resolve much on the peninsula unless North Korea collapses, and we've seen North Korea is immune to collapsing. It can levitate literally 1 inch above the ground, but it will not collapse. And so we are just getting into a situation where either the North Korean regime has to be either completely bought out or it has to be eliminated. And unfortunately, we're not seeing good signs in this regard. Even Mr. Yoon's audacious initiative has gone nowhere, and expectedly it has gone nowhere. So I don't see balance because I don't think this South Korean president is looking for balance, and Washington is perhaps happy that way.
Ironically, this visit also includes a visit to the Korean War Monument in Washington, D.C. Remember what happened then, that the Korean Peninsula was caught in a very delicate situation and things didn't go well, and that's why there was a war, and that's why there was decades of tragedies for separated families, for example, and also later security threats for decades regarding Korean Peninsula nuclear issues. So, Ms. Lim, if history could be a lesson for all of us, well, if we could learn a lesson, that is, there's a lot of inspiration, in fact. Even this visit could get, if the focus is about learning from history and trying to figure out solutions rather than a rhetoric war.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, again, of course, Korean people, South Korean people, we all love peace, and this country is a basically trader. We are living what again, the trading, exports and imports are crucial for our daily life. So for our, sake, definitely we want peace, we want balance, we want more like harmonious situations. But the thing is, again, as I mentioned, Russia's invasion to Ukraine was literally eye-opening moment to especially younger people, young people who didn't experience the war, even though, our basically Korean male, they are supposed to go to the military, as their duty. But still, we didn't see this kind of war, and we didn't expect this kind of war in the 21st century. And last year's that moment, again, was literally eye-opening to many of us. And we thought that, this kind of thing can happen. And that was one big reason why, again, the conservative leadership was, able to be back, even though, the then candidate Yoon Suk-yeol was not that great, again, the popular, but still, many of us agreed probably that we need a deterrence capability. So probably if I go back to your that question, lessons from our history, definitely, again, we want peace, but peace might not be just a slogan. How to achieve it, we need definitely more like the detailed methods. And for now, this government thinks the deterrence capability is the number one priority before we move on to the dialogue. Unfortunately, which is not, again, what we really wanted to have.
Okay, let's go to Professor Shen on this as well. Professor Shen, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. So tell me more about how China is looking at this visit. If you can talk from a Chinese scholar's perspective, at the critical time, South Korean president visiting Washington, of course, bilateral issues likely to be high on the agenda. Meanwhile, trilateral issues, Washington, Japan, South Korea, especially the historical differences between Japan and South Korea, just to understate what actually was going on between the two countries. Professor.
Well, I only talk about my own view. I cannot speak for China's view.
Sure.
I think this is a very important occasion because South Korean incumbent president would pay a state visit to the U.S. U.S. does not organize state visit very often in a year, so it's great. But South Korea may need to pay a cost to get this opportunity, because U.S. would demand South Korea to assist America in security and in economic area. In economic area, U.S. want to use all resources available to contain China, especially in South Korea's context. How not to increase South Korea's chip manufacturing capability in China, and possibly to relocate some of such investment from China to other places. And probably South Korean business is uninterested in this idea. So how South Korean president would protect his own domestic economic interest without still could improve relations with Washington. That's a delicate job.
Want to come
And
back?
also,
Yeah, please go ahead.
also for trilateral security partnership between Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington, I have no idea that I have no objection if they can improve their partnership, but only with one reservation. If they try to improve security cooperation in order to counter China's legitimate interest, for instance, when China need to do something to counter the pro-independence Taiwan efforts, and South Korea would work with Tokyo and Washington to resist China, that would be very unhelpful and very unfortunate.
Let me go through some of these issues with Ms. Lim as well. Two issues mainly. One is economic cooperation, quote unquote, that Washington would like to see. Especially we know that over the past year, there has been South Korean investment in the United States, chip makers, for example, and also electronic vehicle makers as well. So how do you see the compromise, if I could use this very neutral word, that South Korean president is likely to make to Washington regarding bilateral trade? But when it comes to South Korea trade with China, which is huge, shall I say, in the overall map of South Korea international trading relations, how is the president of South Korea likely to handle this issue? What he needs to bear in mind?
Yeah, that's probably more difficult issue. I'm not saying, North Korea's nuclear threat is less important or less serious than the economic issues. But these days, so-called economic security issue is increasingly more and more important, especially for a country like Korea. Again, we are a trader. As when the U.S.-China's relation is good, that's again the best time for a country like Korea. But as long as U.S. and China's are now competing, especially for the technological hegemony, again, this is not what we wanted to have, but this is the reality we face. Again, we see this, competition surrounding again the technological hegemony. And having had that, again, we do see the so-called restructuring of global value chain. And as long as all this, structural changes are moving on, again, even though we want to have a balance, but at the same time, we need to prioritize something more critical to our survival. Again, I truly hope many of our Chinese friends do understand how serious a situation South Korea faces. Again, this is not what we wanted to have, but this is again the reality we see. So definitely, this is the difficult time for us. But again, I'm keep saying this. This is the reality we have.
Well, let's also have Professor Shen, since your South Korean counterpart, calling on the understanding of the Chinese friends. What is your understanding? Then I go to Mr. Gupta. I understand he's back into the conversation. Let's go to Professor Shen very briefly.
Well, personally, I very well understand, and even I'm sympathetic with South Korea's security situation. And South Korea face missile threat, and with a neighbor their own sibling to test nuclear weapon, long-range missile, etc. And the U.S. does not allow South Korea to test similar equipments. But I do think South Korean people are very smart. They have their own wisdom. How to use the wisdom to achieve two things. One is to defend their own country, and also without annoying other partner. China can help South Korea. And China can also be pushed by South Korea to a direction that may be unfavorable to South Korea. I do hope why South Korean professors need us to understand. I urge my South Korean counterparts would also understand China situates in a delicate position.
Yeah, we are all having smiles on our face because we know that at a time of strategic deterrence, it seems that some parties are trying to exercise in the international relations. Mutual communication is very important, to say the least. But let me have Mr. Gupta also to join. Welcome back, Mr. Gupta. Your thoughts on the trade issue that South Korean president visiting Washington needs to convey to Washington for Washington's understanding about where South Korea is and its survival line in terms of trade.
Yes, that's a very important point, and obviously a very important issue. Now, what the South Koreans do have agency out here. I think the sense in Seoul is that we are being whipsawed this way and the other, and we just have to do what we have to do, and therefore the US is doing these things and we have to follow. I don't necessarily buy into that. You know, in the area of semiconductors, the United States has real dominance in that sector and is in a position to even punish South Korea if South Korea were to stray. And so South Korea does not have that many options, and it must follow more or less the dictates of the US and try to create a little space for itself. But in the electric vehicle sector, in the battery sector, the US is not the market leader. China is the market leader. The South Koreans have agency to say that we will go where the market leader is, and we will not be technologically decoupled from the market leader, and you must make those adjustments at your end. And South Korea needs to communicate that it can take more robust positions, because at the end of the day, the Chinese market is huge. There's a huge amount of revenue and turnover gained by South Korean companies. A lot of that goes into research and development. And particularly in areas where China is a dominant market leader, South Korea cannot be tied or locked in with countries, and I'm talking here particularly the United States, which is not the market leader and is kind of a laggard in some respects. And by being tied to the United States, the South Koreans become a laggard in that area too. So the South Koreans have to handle this a little bit more intelligently, and this requires plain speaking on the part of South Korea to the United States, that this is not just about selfish South Korean interests, but that the US and Chinese need to work together in broader settings economically, so that countries are not placed in these sort of situations.
Mr. Gupta, it seems that you are trying to suggest that countries need to look a bit farther than the moment of now, that there has to be more concrete thinking and strategies rather than rhetorics following certain slogans and terminologies. That's very interesting. To you, Ms. Lim, your take on that?
Well, again, I can agree more with the Mr. Gupta's comment. Again, EV battery market, especially in this area, China's dominance, market dominance, or technological dominance, or even raw material related things is huge. It might not be that really easy for US or any other major economy to catch up or to replace China's presence in the near future. We know, of course, that's really the serious reality. And again, for South Korea-like country, when the division of labor was well distributed between the major economy, that's again the best situations. But again, of course, we now have a different reality. So having had this kind of, again, the different difficult reality, of course, South Korea's company, especially business people, their concerns are huge. Again, alliance is mainly for, of course, military purpose, military interest rather than economic interest. But again, as long as, again, this alliance relationship should be maintained for our survival. Again, we are trying to make a cooperation with the United States as well.
Yeah. So what is survival? What does survival mean? What does security mean? And what does a balance between business and security, economic development? These are all big words that needs to be further interpreted with facts, and I guess with stories going on around the world during this great transition time. Having said that, though, let me go to, once again, another point Professor Shen just mentioned about the issue of territorial integrity. For example, the issue of Taiwan that China considers very dearly to the heart of China. Mr. Gupta, how do you see this trilateral alliance taking place between Japan, South Korea, likely to be further strengthened this time during the visit by South Korean President to the United States, and the United States? Meanwhile, you also see earlier engagement among the three Northeast Asian neighbors, China, Japan, and also South Korea as well. So how do you see these different platforms, different times, the roles that it's likely to play?
The question of trilateralism is a really interesting one because fortunately from an economic standpoint we are beginning to again see the shoots of economic trilateralism begin to blossom. You know, the three countries are going to be sitting down for a trilateral meeting which has primarily an economic component. We have to remember also, you know, the RCEP trade agreement came into effect and all three countries are part of RCEP, so there is a sort of a free trade arrangement among those countries in the context of RCEP. Now, with regard to security trilateralism, in the China-South Korea foreign ministers meeting, I think they came up with a very clear consensus of the 3 no's and the 1 restrict. The 3 no's being no additional THAAD deployment, no trilateral military alliance, and I think it was no joining the US missile defense system, and the restrict was that the THAAD system would be restricted up to a point. And this is important because if that consensus holds, then with regard to security trilateralism, yes, that would be relevant to the Korean Peninsula, but that it would not be extended out in any way beyond the Korean Peninsula, say to the Taiwan issue. And I think it's not been helpful by South Korea jumping on the bandwagon in terms of internationalizing the Taiwan issue in, say, the recent interview or in the joint statement which will come out, because at the end of the day, South Korea needs to think more with regard to the 38th parallel and its nuclear armed neighbor north of the 38th parallel, rather than figuring out how it could assist in a Taiwan scenario which it absolutely cannot, because it is going to be consumed by that focus northwards. And so I think there would be he should be a little bit more cautious with his words, I would suggest.
We have about 1 minute left, so maybe 30 seconds for the other 2 guests. Let's go to Ms. Lim first.
Well, again, Taiwan issue is really, of course, delicate issue. And of course, President Yoon's, what he is trying to say can cause many those, criticism, not only just from the China, even from our domestic audience too. But probably I will say, he wanted to see, again, the peaceful situation in this region. That's, I think, what he was trying to say.
Professor, let's go to also the Chinese professor, please.
Well, I think the Korean Peninsula stability issue could be linked to Taiwan issue, unfortunately. But it all depends upon the wisdom of Korean people and American people and Chinese people to delink them, not to tie them together. We should promote a win-win. Korean Peninsula should keep its stability, and denuclearization should have a fruitful outcome. Meantime, the cross-Taiwan Strait relationship would be peaceful, stable, and reaching an all win-win endgame, which is the happy reintegration of the 2 parts of entire China.
It's very interesting we talk about diplomacy. If diplomacy is to get things worse, we don't need diplomacy. The reason we need diplomacy is that we need to make things better. Thank you so much for all of you joining us. Professor Shending Lee, Mr. Surab Gupta, and Professor Yang Jiang Lim. Thank you so much for joining us. All the best to all of you. That's all the time we have for today. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.